I have really good friends who absolutely love the police, of both races. And we'll just say black and white. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to exclude anybody, but we'll stick to this for now. And then I have really good friends who absolutely hate the police of both races. And I had an interesting conversation with a really good friend of mine. He's a male black. I mean, this guy is probably the smartest person you could ever meet in your life. He's super accredited. I won't say his name because he probably don't want that information out there. But I mean, you could Google this dude. He's got book. He's crazy, right? And he brought up a good point, and I've heard it before, but I never really thought about it in depth. And it's this. I'll just ask. I'll ask you, Ryan. What started the police? Like what started police officers?
Slave patrols.
So it's slave patrol, but I've actually done some research on this.
Okay.
And
I like where this is
so
going.
the research I found on it is that it wasn't necessarily slave patrol. It was more so patrols for businesses, like making sure that the wealthy people's businesses were protected and maintained. So there's truth and non-truth to this slave patrol thing. Because I've had a research because I've got hit up all the time about
we should do a video like on that. That's interesting. I've never heard that
of how policing started.
Yeah.
And it's pretty interesting. But go ahead. So yes, to answer your question, in part slave patrol, but there's also a lot of falsehoods. Is that a word?
We just making up words today, man. We're rolling with it.
There's not some truths to that as well. But go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm getting to your answer, Billy. So with that said, and he sent me a couple links. We'll have to like do like maybe a bigger segment on that itself. But with that said, you have to take into consideration my grandmother has stories where she was like openly harassed by the police for being an African American, right? For being black. So you really can't blame her for telling her children. She had 10 kids. You really can't blame her for telling her children, hey, the stove is hot. And that's an analogy, right? Like we all know as adults, if I touch the top of the stove, it's going to be hot. So I tell my children, because I care about them, hey, don't touch the top of the stove. You'll burn your hand. So as my grandmother growing up in the time that she did, and experiencing what she experienced, she's telling us, hey, be careful out there. There are police officers who will take you to jail, beat you, do whatever. And she's not doing that from a hateful stance, because my grandma was like the biggest church woman, big hats on Sundays, right? Didn't have a hateful bone in her body. She was doing that from a loving standpoint. Like, hey, I care about my children. I don't want you to go through what I've went through. So the stove is hot. Don't touch the stove. And then maybe we'll say half, right? So maybe half of her children experienced one or two run-ins with the police where they're like, ooh, my grandmother told me about this. I knew that she wasn't lying. And then the other half, maybe they didn't experience anything, but it's in the back of their head. So we'll take the 5 that never experienced anything, right? If they turn on the TV, what do they see? Police officers beating people of color, minorities. If they turn on the radio, what do they hear? F the police did this. If they turn on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, right? It's always something negative. So that is just watering the seed that my grandmother planted, right? So then in their head, when they have a kid, which would be me, they pass that down, right? So now we're talking about our generation, which is how it got to it. So when people ask me questions like that, like I can't wait to jump on it because I've seen both sides. I have seen people who have never experienced anything negative with the police have such a deep-seated hate for law enforcement. But I always caution people to take a step back and kind of look at it like, well, maybe that person's parents or that person's grandparents experienced something and said, hey, just so you know, don't really touch the top of the stove because it's hot, So when you go out and when you're driving and you see a police officer, make sure you set up straight and you take your hat off, because that was something I was taught at an early age. When you see the police, you take your hat off because you don't want to be identified as a certain culture. You set up straight because you don't want to be identified. You turn your music down, you roll your windows down. Like those were just things to help you from not having to interact with police officers. So, that's my jam. And I'm glad you asked that, Billy.